She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not throw dishes across the kitchen floor or demand answers in the middle of the night. She simply stood there, in the pale yellow light of their master bathroom at 2 in the morning, holding his phone with both hands, reading a message that had not been meant for her eyes. 7 words. Just 7 words that collapsed 23 years of a life she had spent believing in, sacrificing for, and quietly surviving inside of. I still think about you every night. She read it once. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down on the cold marble counter, walked back to her side of the bed, and lay there staring at the ceiling with her eyes wide open until the sun came up. She did not make a sound. Because by that point, after everything she had endured, silence had become her oldest and most faithful companion. Her name is Sarah Calloway, and what happened to her over the course of 2 decades will make you question everything you think you know about loyalty, love, endurance, and the price a woman pays when she chooses to stay. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah grew up in a small town in central Tennessee, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where Sunday mornings meant church pews and potluck lunches, and where a good marriage was considered the highest achievement a woman could claim. She was the second of 3 daughters raised by a school teacher mother and a quietly devoted father who worked double shifts at a paper mill so that his girls could have what he never did. Growing up, Sarah watched her parents hold hands across the dinner table. She watched her father leave a single rose on her mother's pillow every anniversary without fail. She grew up believing that love was steady, that it was a choice made every morning, and that a good man honored his word because his word was all he truly owned. That belief became the lens through which she saw the world. It also became the wound that would take her nearly a quarter century to heal. She met Daniel Calloway in the fall of her junior year at the University of Tennessee. He was a finance major from Nashville, a tall and confident in the easy way of someone who had never questioned whether he belonged in a room. He wore his ambition like a second skin. He made people feel important when he spoke to them, which is the most dangerous kind of charm there is because it feels like love before it has earned the right to be called that. Sarah was cautious at first. She had been raised to take her time with important things, and instinctively she sensed that Daniel Calloway was an important thing. But he was persistent and he was clever, and he arrived at her dorm room one November evening with hot coffee and a worn copy of her favorite novel and a smile that seemed to say he had been paying attention. That was the beginning. She had no way of knowing it was also the beginning of the longest lesson of her life. They dated through the rest of college and survived a long-distance stretch when Daniel took an internship in Atlanta and married in a small outdoor ceremony in June, the summer after graduation. Sarah wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. Daniel wrote his own vows, which made half the guests cry. He said he would spend every day trying to be worthy of her, that she was the truest thing he had ever found, and that he intended to prove it not in grand gestures, but in ordinary faithfulness. The guests applauded. Sarah wept. Her father squeezed her hand at the altar and whispered that Daniel had better mean every word. He did not know, and neither did she, just how hollow those beautiful words were going to turn out to be. The first year of their marriage felt charmed. They moved into a rented townhouse in Nashville. Sarah landed a job as a graphic designer with a mid-sized marketing firm. Daniel climbed fast at a regional investment company, working long hours that he seemed to relish, coming home late but always with stories that made Sarah laugh over reheated dinner. They were building something. They could feel it. They talked about children, about a house with a yard, about a future that glittered with the particular brightness of 2 people who believe they are in the right place at the right time with the right person. And then, in the spring of that first year, the brightness flickered. It started with a feeling she could not name, a slight shift in the temperature of their evenings together. Daniel would come home distracted, his eyes somewhere else even when he was looking right at her. His phone, which had always been left casually on the kitchen counter, began traveling everywhere with him, to the bathroom, to the garage, to the back porch when he stepped out for air. He started taking calls in his car before coming inside. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that ambitious men carried stress like extra weight and that she needed to be patient, to be understanding, to be the steady one. She had been raised in a tradition that prized a woman's calm. She believed that a good wife did not manufacture trouble from her own anxiety. So she waited, and she watched, and she tried very hard not to see what was already right in front of her. The confirmation came on a Tuesday in April. She'd gone back to their office after leaving her laptop charger, and as she passed his building, she saw his car still in the parking garage at 7:30 in the evening. She did not stop. She told herself it meant nothing. But on the way home, something guided her to circle the block one more time, and that second time she saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the parking structure, leaning against the wall, talking to a woman with dark hair and a red coat. Their closeness was unmistakable. It was the closeness of people who knew each other in a way that went beyond the professional. Sarah drove past. She did not honk. She did not stop. She went home, made dinner for one, and sat at the kitchen table until he walked through the door at 9:15 with a story about a client call running long. She smiled. She served him his plate. She said nothing, and something inside her, something small and essential, went very quiet. She confronted him 2 weeks later, after she found a receipt for a hotel downtown tucked into the pocket of his suit jacket while doing laundry. She had rehearsed the conversation in her head 100 times. She had prepared herself to be calm, to be clear, to ask and listen and decide what came next based on what she heard. What she did not prepare for was the wall she ran directly into. Daniel did not crumble. He did not beg. He did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He got angry instead. He turned the confrontation inside out with the practiced ease of someone who had been waiting for it and had already built his defense. He told her the receipt was from a dinner with colleagues. He told her she was jealous and insecure. And he told her that this was exactly the kind of irrational behavior that made things difficult between them, and that if she could not trust him after everything he provided for them, then perhaps she needed to examine her own issues. He said it all calmly, systematically, and with a quiet contempt that frightened her more than shouting ever could have. She left the room shaking. She told herself she must have misread things, and she stayed. She stayed because she was 24 years old and scared, and because her mother had always said that marriages required endurance. She stayed because she had no savings of her own and was barely 6 months into a new job in a new city where she knew almost no one. She stayed because Daniel, in the days that followed, became briefly and almost convincingly tender again, bringing flowers, making plans for the weekend, speaking to her with the softness she had fallen in love with. She stayed because she wanted to believe she was wrong, and she stayed because no one around her, not her friends, not her family, not the women at her church, seemed to find it strange that a young wife would doubt herself before she doubted her husband. That was simply what women in her world had always done. The years accumulated. Each one brought new chapters of the same story. Sarah rose at her design firm, earned promotions, built a name for herself in the Nashville creative community. They bought a house in a quiet neighborhood in Brentwood. They had a daughter, Lily, born on a rainy Wednesday in October when Sarah was 27, and then a son, Nathan, 3 years after that. From the outside, the life they were building looked like the fulfillment of every promise Daniel had made at their altar. A beautiful home, healthy children, a successful husband, a capable wife. The version of American family life that filled Christmas card envelopes and made neighbors offer quiet envy wrapped in polite compliments. But inside that house, the temperature had never fully recovered. The warmth that came and went in Daniel's behavior began to feel less like intimacy and more like management. He gave her enough to keep her anchored, not enough to make her feel cherished. It was a calibration she did not consciously recognize for years, and by the time she did, she had spent so long inside it that she had begun to mistake it for normalcy. There were moments over the years when the truth would surface like a stone through shallow water, unavoidable and cold. A name she did not recognize appearing too frequently in his schedule. A business trip to Charlotte that a colleague unknowingly mentioned he had not attended. A phone call that ended abruptly the moment she walked into the room and was explained away before she had the chance to ask a single question. Each time, she would enter that familiar territory of quiet confrontation, and each time Daniel would hold his ground with the same unsettling calm, denying, redirecting, and eventually, after enough days had passed, softening just enough to make the question feel unreasonable. He was masterful at it. The cruelest part was not the lying itself, but the way the lying was designed to make her feel as though her own perception was the problem. Over time, she began to wonder if she was too sensitive, too suspicious, and too difficult to love. That was the deepest damage, and it was invisible. It left no marks. By the time Sarah was in her mid-30s, she had stopped confronting him at all. Not because she no longer saw the signs. She had become extraordinarily skilled at reading them, but because confrontation cost her more than silence did. Every time she raised her voice against his behavior, she paid for it in days of cold distance, pointed remarks about her adequacy, and the particular loneliness of sleeping beside someone who was present in every physical sense and absent in every way that mattered. She calculated the emotional cost and chose the path that hurt less in the immediate term, even knowing it was shredding her in the long term. That is what years of this kind of pain teaches a person. It teaches them to manage suffering rather than escape it. It teaches them to organize their days around the avoidance of new wounds rather than the healing of old ones. It teaches them, slowly and without permission, to shrink. She poured herself into her children. Lily and Nathan became the organizing principle of her life, the reason she got up on the hardest mornings, the audience for her warmth and her creativity, and the full force of a love she had nowhere else to direct. She helped Lily with science fair projects and coached Nathan's baseball team on Tuesday afternoons even while managing a full-time career. She cooked meals that took hours and packed lunches with handwritten notes and was present for every school play and parent-teacher conference and minor childhood emergency with a steady, to smiling reliability that the people around her admired openly. They called her remarkable. They called her strong. They had no idea what was holding her together. She did not tell them. She had become so practiced in the art of appearing fine that she could no longer remember what genuinely fine had felt like. Daniel, for his part, continued to succeed. His career had flourished through his 30s. By the time he was 40, he was a senior partner at a wealth management firm, with a reputation built on the kind of quiet confidence he had always worn so naturally. He was respected at work. He was visible at community events. He gave generously to causes that put his name in newsletters. People spoke well of him in rooms where Sarah was often standing. She would smile and nod and feel the particular ache of knowing that the man being praised was a careful construction, that behind the civic generosity and easy handshakes was a private life built entirely on whatever he wanted it to be at any given moment, consequences distributed exclusively to the woman who had promised to love him in sickness and in health. There were other women. She was certain of this without ever needing a specific name or a signed confession. The pattern was consistent enough, the silences specific enough, the small behavioral tells too practiced to be accidental. And she had a conversation once with a woman she barely knew, a friend of a friend at a neighborhood gathering, who had recently left a marriage of similar architecture and who described her experience with a precision that made Sarah feel as though she were listening to a recording of her own interior life. That conversation shook her badly, not because it introduced her to something new, but because hearing her own reality reflected back in someone else's voice stripped away the last thin layer of possibility that she had imagined things. She was not imagining things. She had never been imagining things. She drove home from that gathering and sat in her car in the driveway for 45 minutes before she could compose herself enough to walk inside. She began, around this time, to research. Quietly, carefully, with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that emotion is a luxury and information is armor. She read about financial independence and what it took to build it. She read about the legal landscape of divorce in Tennessee and what a woman in her situation might reasonably expect from the process. She spoke to an attorney, just once, briefly, as a consultation framed as a general inquiry, and listened carefully to everything she was told. She was not ready to act. But for the first time in a very long time, she was preparing. That preparation felt like the first real breath she had taken in years. It felt, quietly, like the beginning of something. And then, everything changed on an ordinary Thursday evening in November. Daniel had left for what he described as a late dinner with a client. Sarah was helping Nathan finish a history assignment at the kitchen table. Lily was upstairs. The house was settled into its evening rhythms. At 9:43, Sarah's phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize, but the area code was local, and something about the hour made her answer on the second ring. The voice on the other end was professional and measured, the particular tone of someone trained to deliver difficult information without additional drama. There had been an accident on Interstate 65 South. A vehicle matching Daniel's registration had been involved in a multi-car collision near the Brentwood exit. He was being transported to Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She needed to come. She called her neighbor to sit with the children. So she drove to the hospital with a stillness inside her that she could not entirely explain. Not numb exactly, but very quiet. As if the part of her that registered emergency had been worn down to a wire over the years of smaller emergencies no one had ever acknowledged. She arrived to find Daniel in the trauma unit with injuries more severe than the phone call had prepared her for. The accident had been catastrophic. A distracted driver in an SUV had crossed the center median at highway speed. Daniel's car had taken the impact directly on the driver's side. Both of his legs were crushed. There was significant internal bleeding. The surgical team was already working on him when she arrived, and the attending physician met her in a quiet corridor with the kind of careful language that told her the situation was serious in ways that might not be fully known for some time. She sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. She called her mother in Tennessee. She updated Lily and Nathan with as much calm as she could manage. She drank terrible coffee from a machine near the elevator and stared at a painting of a river on the waiting room wall and thought about 7 words on a phone screen. I still think about you every night. She had read those words 3 weeks earlier. She had said nothing. She had carried them with her every single day since, turning them over and over like a stone in a pocket. And now she sat in a hospital corridor waiting to learn whether the man who had written them or received them was going to survive the night. The complexity of what she was feeling defied any single word she could have reached for. It was not uncomplicated grief. It was not relief. It was not anger. It was something older and harder, something that had no clean name, something that had accumulated over 23 years of a marriage that had never fully been what it had promised to be. Daniel survived. The surgeries took 12 hours across 2 separate procedures. He lost significant function in both legs. The orthopedic team was cautiously optimistic about partial mobility with extensive rehabilitation, but the picture that emerged over the following days was one of permanent and profound change. The man who had moved through the world with such easy authority who had played tennis on Saturday mornings and taken the stairs two at a time and commanded rooms without apparent effort, would now navigate the rest of his life in a wheelchair, at least for the foreseeable future and likely far beyond it. The adjustment required by this reality was staggering, and it fell, as these adjustments almost invariably do, primarily to his wife. Sarah became his primary caregiver. She did this not out of obligation made explicit, but out of the same deep-wired sense of duty that had kept her inside this marriage through everything else. She had been raised to believe that you did not abandon someone when they were suffering. Whatever Daniel had done to her, whatever she knew about the life he had been living behind her back, he was still the father of her children, still the man she had promised herself to in front of God and everyone she loved. She could not walk away from a hospital bed. She was not built for that, and so she stayed. She learned how to help him transfer from the wheelchair. She managed his medications and attended his therapy appointments and communicated with his care team and answered the hundreds of messages and phone calls that flooded in from people who had no idea who Daniel Calloway had privately been. She was gracious to all of them. She said the right things. She held herself together in public with a composure that drew genuine admiration from everyone who witnessed it. What no one witnessed were the nights. The nights, alone in the bedroom they still technically shared. It's when the silence of the house pressed down on her with a weight she could barely breathe under. When she lay still in the dark and thought about all of the years she had spent measuring her own needs against his comfort. When she thought about the children growing up in a household where their mother smiled through pain she never named. When she thought about who she might have been if she had chosen differently at 24. She did not cry often in those nights. She had cried so much in the early years that the reservoir had slowly emptied. What came instead was a clear-eyed reckoning, quiet and relentless, the kind that can only arrive after a person has finally stopped running from what they know. 3 months after the accident, something happened that became a turning point Sarah would later describe as the moment the last thread snapped. She was clearing out his home office to convert it into a more accessible space for his rehabilitation equipment. In the back of the bottom desk drawer, beneath a folder of old tax documents, she found a phone. It was not his current phone. It was older, a cheap prepaid device she had never seen before. Her hands were steady when she picked it up. Her chest was not. The battery was dead, but she found a compatible charger in a drawer of old electronics and plugged it in. When the screen came to life 20 minutes later, it contained everything. A separate line, a separate identity, a communication history that stretched back not 3 years or 5 years, but 11 years. 11 years of messages, photographs, and a parallel emotional life conducted with apparent ease alongside the marriage he had been performing for everyone around him. There was not just one woman. There had been several sequentially, each relationship overlapping with periods Sarah had thought were stable, periods she had, in some cases, clung to as evidence that things were better, that her patience had been rewarded, that they were turning a corner. They had not been turning a corner. He had simply been rotating his attention between competing priorities, none of which had ever placed her at the center. She sat on the floor of that office for a very long time. She did not make a sound. She did not go to him with the phone in her hands and demand answers. She already had every answer she would ever need. What she did instead was think, and with a clarity she had not felt in years, about what she was going to do next. And for the first time in 23 years, the answer that rose in her, quietly, without drama, without negotiation, was not about him at all. It was entirely about her. She called the attorney whose number she had saved in her own phone 3 years earlier. She made an appointment for the following Monday morning. She spent the weekend behaving exactly as she always had, managing Daniel's care routine, cooking for the family, responding to texts from well-meaning friends, and she felt, beneath the surface of all of it, a stillness that was different from the silence she had lived with for so long. The old silence had been the silence of suppression, of swallowing what she felt to protect a structure that was never going to protect her back. And this new stillness was something else entirely. It was the silence of a decision already made. It was the silence of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for permission to be free. The legal process was long and, at moments, deeply unpleasant. Daniel's attorney, hired swiftly once it became clear what was happening, was skilled at minimizing and deflecting in exactly the way Daniel himself had always been. There were disputes about assets, about the timeline of his infidelities, about what could be proven and what could only be known. Sarah had documentation. She had the prepaid phone, which she had photographed meticulously before handing it to her attorney. She had financial records that told their own story. She had 23 years of quiet observation and the memory of a woman who had learned, through necessity, to pay very close attention. The process took 18 months. It was not easy. There were days when the weight of it all made her question whether she had the energy to see it through. There were nights when the children's confusion and grief, particularly Nathan's, who at 16 was old enough to understand something of what was happening but not old enough to fully process it, made her feel the particular agony of a mother who cannot shield her children from a pain that is not of her own making. But she saw it through. She saw it through because she had spent 23 years not seeing things through for herself, and she understood at this stage of her life that the cost of stopping now was higher than the cost of continuing. She saw it through because Lily, then 19 and a sophomore at Vanderbilt, pulled her aside one Sunday evening and said, quietly and without preamble, that she had always known something was wrong, that she was proud of her mother for doing this, and that she needed her mother to be okay more than she needed the family to look a certain way from the outside. Sarah had held her daughter in the kitchen and cried, genuinely, fully, the kind of crying that comes from being witnessed after years of invisibility. It was one of the most significant moments of her life. The divorce was finalized on a gray morning in March. Sarah sat in her attorney's office and signed her name and felt the particular combination of exhaustion and relief that arrives at the end of something that required everything you had to endure. She was 47 years old. She had gray threaded through her hair that she had stopped trying to conceal. She had lines at the corners of her eyes from years of both worry and laughter, because even inside the most difficult chapters, there had been laughter, and she had always been grateful for that. She walked out of the building into the cool March air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Just breathed. The city moved around her with its ordinary urgency, and she felt for the first time in as long as she could specifically remember that she was standing in her own life on her own terms. She rented an apartment on the east side of Nashville, a third-floor unit with tall windows and original hardwood floors and a kitchen that she painted pale green on a Saturday afternoon with Lily and a playlist they built together, laughing over bad pop songs from their respective childhoods. She furnished it slowly and deliberately, choosing only things she genuinely loved, things that had no history attached to them that she did not want to carry. She bought a second-hand reading chair in a deep rust color and positioned it beside the largest window, where the afternoon light came in long and warm, and she spent many hours in that chair over the months that followed, reading, thinking, doing absolutely nothing, learning what it felt like to simply occupy a space without managing it for someone else. She returned to work with a clarity of focus that surprised even her. Her years at the design firm had given her a portfolio and a reputation, and she used both to launch a small independent studio, taking clients she cared about and setting her own hours and finding. And to her genuine astonishment, that work undertaken freely felt nothing like work at all. It felt like craft. It felt like pride. It felt like the version of her professional life she had always imagined, but had never quite had the stillness inside herself to fully inhabit. Nathan finished high school and applied to college with his mother's steady encouragement beside him. He chose a school in Colorado, which frightened her just enough to be healthy, and when she drove him to the airport, she held him for a long time and then let him go without pulling him back, which she considered one of her finest parenting moments. Lily graduated and took a job in Nashville, and they developed the kind of friendship between a mother and adult daughter that had not been entirely possible while the household had been organized around its secret grief. And they went to farmers' markets on Sunday mornings. They argued about television. They were honest with each other in ways that felt newly possible, and the honesty felt like oxygen. Daniel had moved, after the divorce, to a smaller house closer to his family in Nashville with the assistance of his brother, who had taken on much of the practical management of his care. Sarah heard from the children about his progress in rehabilitation. She did not have feelings about this that she could neatly categorize. She had stopped expecting her feelings about him to be simple a long time ago. What she had was not hatred. It was something closer to the particular clarity that comes after a long illness has finally passed, a gratitude for health that is deepened by the memory of its absence, and a quiet commitment to never confusing suffering for strength again. Because that had been the central confusion of her adult life. The idea that enduring pain quietly was a form of dignity, that staying when leaving was necessary was a form of loyalty, that organizing her entire existence around someone else's comfort while her own well-being quietly eroded was a form of love. It was not any of those things. She understood that now with a completeness she wished she had arrived at far sooner. She did not punish herself for the years. She had been doing the best she could with what she knew at each particular moment, and that was the most honest thing that could be said about any life. But she also understood now that survival without direction is not the same as living, that endurance and flourishing are not interchangeable, and that the woman she had been at 24, cautious, hopeful, full of a love she had never had reason to doubt, deserved better than the decades she had been handed, and that the woman she was now at 47, with her rust-colored reading chair and her pale green kitchen and her small studio full of the work she actually cared about, was not a diminished version of that girl. She was what that girl had been quietly building toward all along, in spite of everything. She started writing. Not for any particular audience at first, just for herself, in a journal she kept on the nightstand. Notes about what she remembered and what she had felt and what she wished someone had said to her in the years when she was most lost. She wrote about the way that cruelty can be administered without raised voices, and the way that a person can be made to doubt their own perceptions so consistently that the doubt becomes a habit of mind rather than a response to specific evidence. She wrote about the peculiar courage required not to leave a difficult situation, because leaving is often described as courage, and sometimes it is, but to tell the truth about it to yourself when you have been telling yourself something else for 20 years. That, she thought, was the harder thing, the recognition. The moment you stop defending the architecture of a life that was hurting you and simply look at it clearly, without flinching, for exactly what it was. A friend from the design world who had known Sarah for years read some of those journal entries, with permission, over coffee one afternoon, and told her that what she was writing mattered, that it was not just her story, that there were women in every city in the country living inside variations of the same chapter, longing for someone to reflect their experience back to them without judgment or simplification. Sarah listened to this with the careful attention she brought to everything. She kept writing. She wrote about the night she had stood in the bathroom holding his phone and read those 7 words. She wrote about the feeling of that prepaid phone in her hands in his office, warm from the charger, full of 11 years of proof. She wrote about the attorney's office in March and the cool air outside and the simple act of breathing. She wrote about Lily's voice in the kitchen and Nathan's backpack disappearing through airport security and her reading chair in the afternoon light. She wrote about all of it, and slowly, that what she was writing began to look less like a private record and more like a document meant to be shared. She published the first piece on a personal website she built herself, because she was a designer, and she knew how, and because doing it herself felt important. The response was immediate and overwhelmed her. Women wrote to her from Tennessee and Texas and Oregon and Massachusetts and from places she had never been. They wrote to tell her they recognized themselves in what she described. They wrote to tell her that reading her words was the first time they had ever seen the particular invisible quality of their own pain named and reflected back to them. Some of them were still inside marriages like the one she described. Some had already left. Some were still trying to decide. They all, in their different ways. I'd said the same essential thing. You described something that I had no language for, and having language for it changed something in me. Sarah read every message. She responded to as many as she could. And she understood, sitting at the desk in her pale green kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window, that the story she had spent 23 years surviving was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something she had not yet fully seen. There is a question that people who survive long years of invisible pain are almost always asked eventually, and it is meant kindly, though it carries within it an assumption that Sarah has spent considerable time examining. The question is, how did you stay? People ask it with genuine bewilderment, and sometimes with a compassion that wants to understand rather than judge. And Sarah has tried over time to answer it honestly. She stayed in the beginning, because she was young and frightened and because the world she had grown up in had not given her a complete picture of what she was entitled to expect from a marriage. She stayed in the middle years because she had children whose lives she did not want to fracture unnecessarily, and because she kept hoping, irrationally, doggedly, in the way that human beings hope against evidence when the alternative is too costly to contemplate, that things would shift. She stayed in the later years because she had been inside it so long that she had forgotten, in a deep and practical sense, what outside looked like. That forgetting is not weakness. It is the predictable result of long exposure to a specific kind of diminishment that works precisely because it is gradual, because it does not arrive all at once but accumulates over years in small, deniable increments, until the person experiencing it has adjusted so completely to the reduced space that they can no longer accurately remember the full dimensions of what they once occupied. What broke that pattern was not a single event, though the accident and the prepaid phone were accelerants. What broke it was time and the slow accumulation of clarity that comes when the mind finally exhausts its capacity for the kind of hope that has no basis in evidence. There is a moment in many long, difficult situations when the scaffolding of the stories we have been telling ourselves, the reassurances, the explanations, and the reasons why this particular situation is different from what it appears to be, simply gives way. It does not always give way dramatically. Sometimes it gives way very quietly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and you look around at what is actually there rather than what you have been willing it to be, and you think, this is not what I deserve. Not because you are angry, though anger is appropriate and often arrives later, but because the recognition is simply true. And once a true thing is recognized clearly, it becomes very difficult to unsee. Sarah says she does not know what she would tell her younger self if she could go back. She thinks about it sometimes, about the girl in her grandmother's pearl earrings at the outdoor ceremony in June, and listening to her new husband promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of her. She does not want to reach back and unmake that day. It produced Lily and Nathan. It produced decades of a life that contained, alongside its suffering, genuine work and growth and tenderness, and the kind of friendship that can only be built inside the long chapters of a life lived fully. She would not unmake any of it, but she thinks that what she might tell that girl, what she wishes she had known, woven into her from the beginning the way her belief in steady love and chosen faithfulness was woven in, is this. The willingness to endure is not the same as the obligation to endure. Strength is not the same as silence. And a woman who chooses herself is not abandoning anyone. She is returning to the person she was always meant to be. She walks every morning now, an early habit she built in the first months after the divorce, something to anchor the day before the noise of it began. She walks through her neighborhood while the city is still waking up, past the coffee shop that opens at 6, and the small park where dogs are walked by owners who nod at her like familiar landmarks. She listens to the sound of her own footsteps. She notices the color of the light at that hour, which is different every morning in ways that she has started to pay attention to as a kind of discipline. She thinks about the day ahead, the work she wants to do, the people she wants to see, the ordinary pleasures that now feel like nothing short of extraordinary to her because she understands, at a molecular level, that their ordinariness is not their smallness, but their abundance. She has come to understand that a life made of ordinary pleasures chosen freely is a rich life, and that she spent too many years measuring richness by metrics that had nothing to do with her. She is writing a book. She has told almost no one, because the book is not finished and she is superstitious about unfinished things, and also because she has spent enough of her life performing for other people's comfort and is in no hurry to perform this particular thing before she is ready. But she is writing it. It is about all of it. The marriage, the years, the quiet suffering, the recognition, the choice, the apartment with the tall windows and the rust-colored chair. It is about what she learned and what it cost and what remains. It is about the strange, non-linear, inconvenient, absolutely real experience of a woman choosing herself after a very long time of choosing everything and everyone else. She does not know what the book will be called. She does not know when it will be finished. She knows only that it will be true, and that it will be hers, and that those two things are enough. There are women watching right now who know exactly what this story feels like from the inside, who recognize something in the first few minutes, the phone in the bathroom, the cold certainty, the performance of normal in the face of the devastating, and who felt in that recognition something that is difficult to name, but that might be called relief. The relief of being seen. The relief of realizing that what you are living is not unique to you and is not the result of your own inadequacy, but is something that happens to capable, loving, intelligent women every single day inside the architecture of relationships that demand everything of them and return too little for too long. If you are inside something like what Sarah survived, you already know the truth. You have known it for some time. The question is not whether you know it. The question is what you are going to do with what you know. Sarah Calloway is 48 years old. She runs her own studio. She has 2 children who are proud of her. She walks every morning before the city fully wakes. She sits in a rust-colored chair in the afternoon light. She is writing a book. She is not finished. None of us, when we are lucky, are finished. But she is free. And she is, for the first time in 23 years, entirely herself. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.